This group has met every week for well over 30 years. You're always welcome here. We meet just about every Thursday night of the year, only a couple of exceptions for holidays. Coming up, we won't be here Thanksgiving. And we won't be here, I guess, the night before Christmas. Right. Oh, and true, yes, I'll go ahead and say that. We will not be here next week because our group has organized the Jung 2019 conference at Silmar. It's actually a very big deal. And if you're interested, find out more. Jean Gebser was a Swiss philosopher, about 25 years, actually 30 years, younger than Jung. But their thought is harmonizable in very important ways, and for some of us, urgently needed models of planetary change. So our conference is titled Conscious Emergence, with the E-M-E-R-G-E-N, and then in parentheses, an E/Y. So a conscious emergence, conscious emergency, either and or both. But folks are coming from all around America. We don't have anybody from outside the U.S. this year, but we do have Steve Rosen presenting, telepresenting from Vancouver. And anyway, it's a wonderful international group. We'll also be videoing everything, and everything will be on YouTube, as has been the presentations at previous Gibson conferences last year in Boulder at Europa University, the year before that in New York, right? I always forget.
Yes.
Boulder, New York, then Seattle, and then San Francisco. And then it goes all around. It goes to many places.
So the important point is it starts at 7:30 next week at Asilomar, and Jeremy Johnson is presenting. And do you have his title by any chance? Something about the Anthropocene?
I don't have his title right on, but yeah.
Okay.
Give us your email. We'll send you all the information.
And unfortunately, whereas here it's kind of a voluntary contribution, because we're at Asilomar and they charge us per person, we have to charge $15. So sorry about that, but it's worth it.
And there are other options as well for food and everything. Many folks are coming and actually staying in residence at Asilomar for the entire weekend.
You can become invisible.
Who becomes invisible?
You can become invisible. It's probably not $15.
Maybe we should talk later. If
It's coming from a man from the cloth.
Right.
40 years.
Visible. Then the week after that, we had dream sculpting in this room, which is always a wonderful occasion and sort of awesome occasion. If you're interested in dream work, ask. Well, I'll just go ahead. We'll be continuing to introduce James Hillman on October 21st. And then we have parties coming up, and they're always completely unpredictable. I quit worrying about them. You never know what's going to happen. Go with the flow. Okay? Well, all together now. I'm very glad to introduce Dan tonight, as soon as I find your spot. Very good. Through the years, folks come to this Monterey Friends. Some folks come once, you never see them again. You hope for the best. And I always sort of feel that the best has happened somehow, even if somebody just comes once, because the nature of this group and our meetings is very open and very free. And for me, those are primary values. But there are also folks who come sporadically or now and then, or appear and disappear, and those who are invisible, as Jeff pointed out. Particularly in this house. But anyway, it's which was built by the pacifists. Dan is one who came once upon a time and is a friend of the friends. And so I am glad to introduce his presentation tonight. Thomas Mann's The Coming Victory of Democracy. Dr. Thomas Mann, among the most popular writers of the 20th century, immigrated from his beloved Germany to the United States because of being exiled by the Nazis. Mostly known for his bestsellers, Buddenbrooks, The Magic Mountain, Death in Venice, Dr. Faustus, Mann produced a wartime journalism legacy that deserves serious attention now more than ever. Dr. Dan Gurska, mythologist and adjunct professor of interdisciplinary studies, presents Thomas Mann's The Coming Victory of Democracy.
Thank you.
All right, so the way that I want tonight to unfold, but I'm open to it going in whatever direction it goes into. But the way that I envisioned it has changed a lot over the last couple of weeks. And so what I'm hoping for out of tonight is to have Dr. Mann's words inspire us to think a little more about our present moment in terms of our democracy. And I want us to be respectful of one another and our ideas. And I want it to not just be me talking at you. And so to honor all those things that I want, I'm going to start with a little bit of an introduction, and then I'm going to hand out a bunch of excerpts from The Coming Victory of Democracy, for democracy. And then I have some questions for you as we work through that. And the way that I'm hoping that will work is I'll read a few excerpts, and then I've already prepared some questions. And then we'll talk a little bit, and then I'll herd the kittens in, and then I'll read some more excerpts, and so on and so forth. And so I hope that that's the rhythm that this follows, but we'll see. I want to thank everyone here for holding the space. It's a different type of talk for me, as was the last talk that I did here, a brief talk on the nature of the myth of white supremacy in our world. And usually I talk about things that are a little more distant, things like, Joseph from Genesis, right? And it's safer to talk about things sometimes that are farther away. And tonight we're going to be talking about democracy because of our present situation. Just today, the President of the United States once again called upon foreign leaders to interfere in our elections. Again, just today. And I'm scared. I'm really scared about the nature of democracy around the world. The myth of democracy that I really do believe in. And that's why we're here, and I want to thank you all for being here and holding this space for me to toil. Democracy is meant to be difficult, so maybe there's going to be a lot of different ideas here tonight. And the way I look at that is the more ideas, the more we are actually creating democracy. And at the same time, I could really use some confirmation bias. And so, I want to start by just first talking about who Thomas Mann is. He was born in 1875, very rich family. He would hate that I don't have a sport coat on, my sport coat. And the volume of his writings is nothing short of miraculous. He wrote every single day of his life. And several of his contributions are well documented. Dissertations, articles, books have been written on his art and its implications. Not a lot on his wartime journalism. And I spent years of my life focused on one of his lesser known pieces, which he considered to be his magnum opus, which was the Joseph cycle, he called it his pyramid. And that was essentially his rewriting of the entire book of Genesis, over 4 novels that spanned 20 years plus of his writing, of his attention. And that book, that cycle, and I'm using that word cycle because he loved Wagner, and he's a good German, so I use that word to talk about his art writing for that, was his escape to budding fascism. His escape on a daily basis, and he would only write up to about 3 pages a day for about 3 hours it would take him. And then he would go straight to the newspapers. Tonight, we're focusing on another one of his treasures that's lesser known, and that is this little tiny book, The Coming Victory of Democracy. This lecture he gave across the United States in the year of 1938, the year that he really set up home in the United States. He left Germany in 1933. That's when Hitler rose to power. He didn't leave. Hitler would have loved it if he would have stayed, and if he would have adopted the Nazi ideology, because Thomas Mann at that time in the world was the most famous writer. German culture pre the brown coats was kind of, the way that we look at French for food or wine today. Like the German writers, the German artists were looked at as the top, and he was living the life. And so it was during this, and the reason why he left on his own accord, was Germany was stifling to him. He was seeing basically morons running things, and it scared him. And he said he just couldn't breathe in Germany anymore. And there's a lot of different myths that emerged out of his exile. A lot of dramas that I won't go into, but they're fun things. And in my dissertation, I wrote an entire chapter on Mann the man, and I go through some of those. But it's a very dramatic leave when he moves to Switzerland in 33, and he just kind of hops around the world. And in 1938, he gets this great deal to go around and give lectures to wide-eyed Americans. And at that time in 1938, Buddenbrooks was on everyone's bookshelf in the United States, but no one read it. It was kind of one of those things that shows that you're an intellectual, like this sweater. It was just something that people used to show that they were cultured. So it was during the speaking tour that he was offered a cushy gig at Princeton University. They offered him housing. I think it was at that time $6,000 a year, and then he only had to do 4 lectures for the entire year. And so he hooked up with his translator, H.T. Lowe Porter, who was living in Princeton at the time, hung out with Einstein, who annoyed him but was a dear friend, and they just had a great time, right? And so he's traveling around the country giving this talk in 1938. Around that same time, he published an essay where he asserted, quote, "There are not 2 Germanys, one good and one evil, but only one. The evil Germany is the good one that went astray. I have it within me, too. I have experienced it myself," end quote. And that essay, that quote from that essay, the essay was titled Brother Hitler, and the subtitle of it, "That Man is My Brother." And this is in 1938. Hannah Arendt, years later, in her Eichmann in Jerusalem, in her report on the banality of evil, that I think is one of the greatest pieces of literature, wartime journalism, makes a similar point in terms of that. And both Arendt and Mann rejected the notion of a good Germany and an evil Germany, and I want us to do the same about our situation. That's sort of either or, a good America and a bad America, which both Mann and Arendt argued against, creates false dichotomies. It's lazy, but above all, it's dangerous. extremely dangerous. And I'll try to keep that idea with me tonight as we talk a little bit about democracy. The reason why I want Mann's wartime journalism to get attention, well, first of all, it's because I don't entirely understand it all. I'm not a political scientist. Like when I was doing my dissertation, you know, I was happy looking at the different myths that he reinvigorated from Genesis through using Hindu traditions, through using Jewish traditions, through using Islamic traditions. And that was so much fun for me. But I couldn't help but like look at his essays, look at the letters he was writing, and realize that they were, you can't separate one from the other. You know, especially when the Jews were on the chopping block in his Germany. And so I started becoming more fascinated with his wartime journalism as I progressed in my dissertation. And my final chapter of my dissertation, which I thought my committee was going to throw in my face because it was weird. I basically at that time, you know, Trump was running for president. You know, Putin and Duterte was seizing power. Xi Jinping was trying to become the totalitarian regime that he successfully has since then. I just couldn't help myself but focus in my final chapter of my dissertation on the political, because at bottom, the thing that I'm most interested in as a mythologist is deconstructing the harmful myths of our time. And right now there are some pretty harmful myths out there that I'm focused on, and they don't happen to be sugar-coated, you know? So that's why I wanted to bring this to the table. I am not a political scientist. I'm not a expert in any way on democracy or anything like that. But reading Thomas Mann's work when I was writing my dissertation and spending years focused on his work, it scared the hell out of me then. Like this little book showed me, you know, in 1938, there was still so much more to unfold, so many more horrors that were going to happen. Yet this man was able to recognize that the victory of democracy is inevitable. And so there is this beautiful, positive, yet German look at our situation. So it might get worse, but there's certainly light at the end of the tunnel. You know, the first 4 blacklists that Goebbels published in Germany had Manns on them. And the Manns loved that. You know, that's probably why the speaking tour got booked. You know, the Mann family was looked at as the first family of anti-fascism. Mann's work has gone in and out of popularity over the years. There was a big influx in popularity in the 80s amid the AIDS crisis, because a lot of scholars like to fixate on the fact that Mann is a homosexual man. And so during the AIDS crisis, there was a focus on him because he was in the closet throughout his life. And that's something that I definitely have no interest in talking about, aside from, you know, the fact that, you know, we fixate on things like that about people that have ideas. And in my dissertation, I even wrote, like, this is what people are fixated on, and I don't want to talk about it, because I believe in a 21st century where we're not fixated on who wants to sleep with who, and that's not the end-all be-all. And so the other thing that is interesting is I'm not alone in thinking that this is insanely relevant. And I posted on Twitter a couple months ago, like as soon as we had the committee meeting, and I knew my date. For some reason, I just felt odd and just posted on Twitter, hey, I'm going to talk about the coming victory, Thomas Mann. And Dr. Tobias Bose, who is an associate professor of German literature at Notre Dame, reached out to me, and he was encouraging me. And he has a book from Cornell University Press about this very thing. And it's called Thomas Mann's War. And it's all about his wartime journalism. And it gets released in November. And so he and I exchanged some pleasantries, and I was like, great, like that was so cool. It's one of those digital happy moments. And we need more of those. We need more of those. And I have to say, I was very relieved to see that his book is being published, because the one thing that I thought that I could do with my dissertation was focus on Mann's wartime journalism and actually write a book and like build on that. And now I don't have to do that. I'm very thankful that I don't have to do that. And I thanked Dr. Bose. And you know, after this nice little encounter, he posted something about the Democracy Will Win lecture tour. Frido Mann, who was Thomas Mann's favorite grandson, who was born in Monterey, California, weird synchronicities, right, is going to be presenting on this very book next weekend in San Francisco and in Berkeley.
Wow.
And when I found out that, I was like, this is way too weird, like way too weird. Frido studied medicine, then theology, and then ended with psychology. And he was a psychotherapist before dedicating himself to his writing. And so Frido is going to be up in San Francisco when we're at Silmar, which I just, when I told my partner Kelsey that, she's like, oh, are you going to try to like bolt up there and see him? And I was like, no, I'm just happy with the synchronicity. Like, I don't need any more from it. The fact that Frido is on tour right now, talking about this very thing, is so affirming to me that this is important. That's all I needed. And, you know, when Mann was living with his wife Katya down in the Pacific Palisades, Frido was born up here. And I can't help but think, even though I know Mann was like, you know, the most important person in the world, and I'm sure that they went down there to see him, I can't help but think like Mann had to be here around that time that this came out. So that's kind of cool. And I know it doesn't surprise any of the friends of Jung that these type of synchronicities happen, but it was pretty fun to see that. And so tonight, what tonight is all about, and I'm not going to try to speed through the excerpts. We'll get to whatever we get to. But there's a quote that'll help us get going, and then I'm going to hand out the excerpts, and then we'll get cracking. But the quote is, the social renewal of democracy is the presupposition and the guarantee of its victory. The social renewal of democracy is the presupposition and the guarantee of its victory. And so tonight in our little, living room here, let's practice a little social renewal when it comes to democracy. All right. Can you hand those that way?
Dan,
Yes.
is that quote your firm belief? I'll hope.
We'll see after tonight. I tend to I don't know if it's his writing or if it's my philosophy or what, but he tends to get me, and so I'm inclined to say it is my belief. I do. And that social reform is multi-pronged. It's psychological, it's spiritual, it's economical. It's a lot of different holes. All right, so the way that I envision this is I'm going to read the first two excerpts on the top of this. The beginning of his lecture begins with false modesty, like so many do. And then it folds right into, American democracy and where it is at that moment. And so instead of reading, right from the beginning where he just does a lot of false modesty, we're going to jump right in. And then after the first two excerpts, I have a question, and then hopefully someone will want to say something, and if not, we'll move to the next section. Does everyone have one? Great. So, no, America needs no instruction in the things that concern democracy. But instruction is one thing, and another is memory, reflection, re-examination, the recall to consciousness of the spiritual and moral possession of which it would be dangerous to feel too secure and too confident. No worthwhile possession can be neglected. Even physical things die off, disappear, are lost if they are not cared for, if they do not feel the eye and the hand of the owner and are lost to sight because their possession is taken for granted. America is aware that the time has come for democracy to take stock of itself, for recollection and restatement, in conscious consideration, in a word, for its renewal in thought and feeling. No worthwhile possession can be neglected. And so my question to you all is, has democracy been neglected? And you can let that wash over you for a moment. But has democracy been neglected? Yeah, James.
Can you define democracy?
So we're going to define democracy. He actually goes into what his definition of it is. But I asked that kind of open-ended, it's not even open-ended, but it is in this group, has democracy been neglected, to kind of get a feel for what we think democracy is in this room first. But he goes into what he thinks democracy is. So does anyone want to offer their idea of what democracy is?
Well, I'm just going to look at it differently and say, has it been neglected or taken for granted?
Mm.
Do we assume we know what democracy is, and we're simply happy with our definition of that in the small world that each of us resides in?
Yeah, I think that's a great follow-up question to it. Sandra?
I would say, depending upon what sphere you look at, like I think cultural democracy is alive and well. I would say economic and social and political, if you can make those distinctions. Democracy is dying in its last throes of agony. And that would include things like the politics of climate change.
So to the extent that, voter turnout reached some pretty low lows in recent elections, 30%. I mean, the biggest group of people in the last election were those who didn't vote. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that people either feel so disempowered by, my vote doesn't really matter, or I'm afraid to vote, I might, something might happen to me, or whatever other reason they're staying away, and giving their power away to the vocal minority. When you consider, what happened with the fall of Rome over several hundred years, you can kind of see a similar thing happening in this country, but sped up. And, the senators became corrupt in Rome. Well, gosh, didn't we just have an indictment really recently, we're starting to see that same kind of corruption that, you know, the political arena has been bought out. And so that's the other part of is democracy, what was the question?
Has it been neglected?
Has it been neglected? To the extent that we let it become so corrupt, I think we've neglected it. However, I do feel the tide is turning. I do feel that people are rediscovering the power of standing up for themselves and saying, my vote does count, and I'm going to do something. Damn it. I'm not going to be scared anymore.
I'm going to build upon things that my friends here said. I don't believe that we've ever had democracy in this country. What we've had has been a Republican system, which has been basically to the benefit of the white male landowners. And it's changing. And to the big deal, I think we owe this to Trump. What it has been played out throughout this past 267 years has been based on some sort of like gentlemanly agreement, in the sense that I know laws are way, you know, kind of like gray in that area, but I'm not going to go there. Thanks to Trump, now we understand that, I mean, most of these things are coming up. The fact that this is a very racist country, the fact that there are original sins that we haven't dealt with properly, the fact that this country is not a real democracy. I mean, our system is not a real democracy. All of these things are coming up to the main arena, and everybody's talking about them, everybody is concerned about them. So actually, I think if anything, it's not dying. Actually, in anything, it's really coming up to the surface for gasping for the, you know, for air, because it's been dying all throughout these 200-something years. We've been telling stories to ourselves that we have a democracy, but it's not. It's not one voice, one vote. It's not, you know, I don't weigh the same as like a Koch brothers, basically.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that what you're pointing to is that right now we're in a moment where it really isn't being neglected. It's
Absolutely.
at the forefront,
Absolutely.
and people are really focused
Absolutely.
on defining what it is, which, you know, is definitely a task that hopefully we can get to tonight here. And, you know, this idea of two, you know, the CNN, the Fox News way of like, here's one opinion, here's another opinion, yell at each other, cut to commercial. That isn't democracy, and that isn't working for us right now. And so right now, all the different modalities that are feeding us all and informing us all, it can be overwhelming and chaotic. But you know, based on what you just said, I feel like we're not neglecting it, at least not today. And today was a big news day. I mean, every day seems to be a big news day in terms of our republic, right? I'd like to go to the next section, which is the next two excerpts. And then I have some more questions and ideas that I would like for you guys to inform me more on. This is a lot of fun. This is working out exactly how I wanted it to, because when I'm alone, left with my own thoughts, it sometimes is, you know, dark. and right now, like when I originally read this and put this in there, I was like, oh my gosh, we neglected it so much, you know. But because of the conversation we're having now, I'm realizing the only reason why we're having this conversation is because we're not neglecting, you know, we're participating. All right, so this next one excerpt, there is a typo right off the bat. The second vantage, that's supposed to be advantage. So the advantage, or the apparent advantage, of the tendencies that are hostile to democracy is, above all, the charm of novelty, a charm to which humanity always shows itself highly susceptible. I repeat, the greatest power, the essential fascination of the ideas and tendencies which threaten democracy today and render it problematical is their charm of novelty. Upon this, the fascists place their emphasis. Of this, they boast. Their revolutionary demeanor, their attitude of youthfulness and opportunism are meant to attract the youth of the world, and in Europe, at least, not infrequently succeed in doing so. Obviously, the susceptibility to the fascist miasma has nothing to do with age or youth. It is much more a question of intelligence, of character, of the sense of truth, of human feeling. That does not prevent its shrill propaganda of youthfulness, its publicity tricks, from presenting democracy as decrepit, decayed, and out of date, stale, and hopelessly tiresome, whereas it pictures itself as highly amusing and replete with life and future possibilities, as its well-known successes are supposed to prove to us. Daring and clever as fascism is in exploiting human weakness, it succeeds in meeting, to some extent, humanity's painful eagerness for novelty. So I have 3 questions I'm going to throw out there. What do you make of Mann's assertions here about novelty? Where have you seen novelty threaten democracy, past, present? And what do you make of this eagerness that he speaks of for novelty that all of us have built in?
Well, it's brilliant in the sense that I think it codes for our fascination with things that are news, that come in the news every day. So in that sense, I think that Lisa's comment and an analogy of history, the Roman Empire decaying in comparison to the American Empire decaying, I think there's so much validity that is based on history that we ought to look at that with a lot of care before. I would ask Lisa, so your optimism that I'm curious about, where does it come from? How would you feel that democracy is being renewed and that we're going through some, growth spurt? Because I see the glass half empty. I'll be honest.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. You know, I want to ask you about the eagerness principle that he addresses, because in your field, I'm sure you've seen that a lot.
And we talked about that the day I spoke about, Fairbairn's insight. He was so intuitive in his perception of the baby waiting for a mother who is enticing, not just a frustrating mom and a very gratifying mom that would divide the world in black and white, but we also wait for a mom that is around the corner. And so this eagerness for news, for things that may come around, is ingrained in our genes. We have this stuff inside. We kind of look on the other side of the fence. That's our natural ability. And unfortunately, capitalism, it's like a dirty word, it's a Marcuse word, is expert in feeding us little bits of biscuits of what,
The shiny coin.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
to talk about, I'm sorry.
No, please, get in there.
To talk about shiny coins, maybe that's the segue I've been looking for. And that is one factor that's coming to do with everything that we're working with here, with Dr. Mann, is what I call cinemasthetics. I don't know what anybody else calls it, but that is everything we're talking about for everybody in this world is seriously and profoundly affected by instantaneous worldwide communication. The fact the new is not separated in time, and for many, not really separated in space. And yet, that's not true for everyone living on this planet. But for those who are plugged into the global communication network, which certainly includes a very significant portion of humanity across many socioeconomic groupings. I mean, you have your farmer in rural southern India who checks satellite data on the cell phone. But at any rate, with all of this, how we are communicating, I mean, I dare say, I mean, anyone else wishes to speak to it, but a lot of what I feel that we're talking about with democracy, whatever we want to use that framing to mean, is seriously conditioned by my online experience.
So, if you want to talk about novelty, let's talk about Facebook. And that is one of the novelties that is at both sides of the coin here. In one sense, it is a result of democracy that it exists in the first place, but it can be used for extreme purposes on the other side, or to control, depending on your ability to do so and what you wish to control.
And this is something we should all be very much paying
John-
attention to.
Yeah, John's point is so well taken. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but it's so well taken. I mean, this is Baudrillard's thesis. He says this is a world online without an opposing element in which the signifier and the signified have been confused. And that takes a lot of reflection to understand. It's a super serious problem. The issue of virtual reality is a really serious problem. And so in that sense, Facebook, yikes. Yikes.
Could not have said that better.
Yikes is
Sandra.
Yeah.
Novelty, just the word causes me to react in horror. It's the new, the shiny, the glitzy, the consumable, the stuff and more stuff, the seduction of the novel without any thought at all. And Hillman wrote a phenomenal book called The Terrible Love of War. And we see cycles of cultures being annihilated again and again and again for this terrible love of war. It seems his only conclusion was, in deeply examining the issue, that it's not defeatable. And so much of our novelty has come out of the industry, the economics of making innovation for war. Or how does it, how does science get used? How does the novel get used? How does film get used for propaganda? How does innovation get perverted into destructive?
Definitely. And so, what Mann's pointing to here is that the fascists used that principle, because so do the people, the lovers of democracy, and he goes into that a little bit. But that principle is the thing that gets weaponized with the fascists. And there is a quote in here that I'm going to be skipping over, but I kept it in there for you all later on if you end up reading this on your own, about how when the fascists eventually go to war, it's to inspire more novelty. Because in times of not war, it gets difficult. People start asking questions, right? But when you have a war machine invading Poland, then it's like, oh, well, this is the focus right now, right? And that's, in terms of, when people call Hitler and Franco and Mussolini and all these tyrants, Duterte, Putin, Kim Jong-un, geniuses, what they mean by that is they're masters of making, I call it the shell game. It's like a novelty, right?
Yes.
And they're not particularly clever, right? It's just they tap into that thing that we all have. Yeah, Lisa.
Well, I want to kind of bring up a counterpoint with their current fascist regime, which is the focus on looking backwards.
We're gonna get to that for sure. But the way in which I love what you're going with, and that's like right next.
Okay.
It's coming up. I promise you. I don't mean to cut you off. Yeah.
how is the way that I see the pure democracy is that democracy as a political system that tends to be mindful of all different views in a society is meant to be a very conservative, inefficient, slow-moving kind of system. I mean, like, you can't go around, be fast and break things in democracy. If in a system that is mindful of ways of thought of the Nazis and at the same time and all the shades in between to Antifa people, I mean, like, just to be you know,
Modern.
exactly, it's going to be very, very inefficient, quote unquote. And that leaves the area open for enterprising people, for innovating people to come in and kind of like denote the fact that this is too slow for the time, for me, for us, whatever, and act as innovators and kind of like guys underneath that kind of. I think that's what he's talking about here. There is always that youthfulness, that kind of like the desire to kind of like to be again moving family, using the Silicon Valley thing going here, moving fast and break things kind of like thing, according to me, as Adolf Hitler, for example, at this point. Jews are bad, let's just exterminate them because that's going to be the problem. It's going to solve the problem. It's very enterprising. It's very enticing. It's very youthful and energetic, as they were. I mean, like, look at Germany in the 1930s. They did a lot of things, but at the same time, they went average. So that's what I think.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that what you're speaking to in terms of democracy is, again, what I feel in terms of democracy is that it's not a quick fix thing, and it's more of a verb than anything. Like, what we're doing right now is democracy, and that's why it's so hard. It's so much easier if I just came up here and said what I think and spoon-fed you all and sent you on your merry way, right? Than actually holding a discussion.
I've been reading Max's book. Max from Santa Cruz has been coming to our group. Yeah, and he talks about the difference between the kind of democracy that is, like, written into various declarations, like, okay, we're going to give you these rights, versus, those rights, and how he looks at how they change over time. But what he's really focused on is the actions of people to basically assert their own rights. And that's kind of what you would say democracy is.
I wish Bax was here, because that's awesome.
Yeah,
that's
I
the kind of
really wish
democracy I want.
he apologized for not being able to come.
Insurgent democracy.
Insurgent, yeah. It's an insurgency. It's a rising up, in an active assertion of rights, as opposed to saying, well, the government says I have the right to, life, liberty.
Exactly.
It's like, I'm taking it. I'm living.
So
Every
these are
time that happens, there is a counter and broader annihilation and a, what did we used to call it?
Counterinsurgency.
An assimilation,
Totalitarianism, repression,
a rape of the values that had just, been asserted and connected to, maybe even like globally, right? There's a opposite. There's an there's a clear opposition, escalation, and co-option, so that it gets talk about being the original impulse, all that positive energy gets somehow made invisible. And, you know, and so it's cyclical. It's cyclical.
I think that's it. I think I totally agree with Lisa and what's being said. I think Chomsky also wrote about this in his view of like an anarchist kind of solution where people are rising up and with the insurgency. And then you're right that when that force comes about, then there's another opposition that tries to squelch that. But I wonder that has it ever been any different throughout history where we're just having to do that, where when there's opposition, we have to come together and seize the moment and have some type of revolution. And there's going to be sacrifices, and that type of fight needs to just continue to happen, I guess, because of the human trauma that we have.
How do you keep that revolution from in turn becoming a kind of oppression? Where the assertion of I mean, I would imagine there'd be a lot of talk about asserting your rights following the loss of World War I. And for the German people, they had their rights trampled on the Entente, and we're asserting ourselves, we're rising up, we're taking control, we're going to be free.
Yeah.
That was their feeling.
This right.
And the Jews were trying to stop that, and the Americans were trying to stop it, the French were trying to stop it.
And this right now, what you guys are all touching on is what I think, what Mann was trying to bring to the surface in 38.
But
because he saw
he wasn't of the people.
No.
I mean, he had to leave. The people wanted him
exactly,
out. You know?
Exactly. But he wanted
democracy wanted him out.
He wanted this consciousness so that because he saw democratic institutions be very polite to this oppression, and we're going to get into that. I want to invite Mann back in the room, but I want David to say one thing, and then yeah.
Do not think about Germany as having a democracy.
Right.
Because after the First World War, a democratic form of government was installed by the Western powers and gave it no strength. There was nobody in power, the government or leadership, that had any strength at all to govern. And so a vacuum was created, and this vacuum was what allowed the rest to take place.
And one of the things that Mann points to that we'll get to is that the kind of democracy he wants is the kind that will kick the shit out of fascism. It's not the one that's just like sitting back.
Is that the one that created the Stasi?
Right. Not that one.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Just check.
I want to bring Mann back in the room. And so we were talking about novelty, which I knew was going to be rich because we see it. And this is, so we're on the last excerpt on the first page. And this is when he talks about how novelty can be a great thing, right? And I want you, when I read this, I don't mean to like incep, but I think, and I wasn't gonna like talk about my personal politics. And so let me just say this. I think that Ayanna Pressley, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are the type of fresh revisionment of democracy. You know, their hashtag, the squad, is an idea of, you know, anyone who believes in equity. That's all they say. If you believe in equity, you can be part of the squad, right? And so a democracy can use this idea of novelty as well, and that's what he's pointing to here. I'm bringing Mann back in the room.
Can I say one thing before you bring Mann back into the room? So the idea of equity is not novel.
No,
okay,
it's not. But
what I see as truly novel in this day and age are the kinds of things that Marianne Williamson is bringing into the conversation, which are a little too far out there for a lot of people, but that's the new consciousness that is trying to emerge, coming through her voice, maybe not completely clearly, but notice how her novelty is being ridiculed, it's being squashed. There's some people who are going,
So you guys are going to have to footnote her to those who do not know her work. You have to put her in some paragraph. So, because I'm very interested in what Lisa's saying.
Yeah.
If you can expand on that.
Yeah, so Marianne Williamson is a best-selling author who's running for president, and she's been kind of shut out by the national spotlight because of her radical approaches and the way in which she presents herself.
Well, not enough people have voted for it.
Shit,
Or
I've been in
given-
the classic, part of the library for so long.
But I, without getting too far away, the reason why I brought up the squad is because they're using novel approaches, but the consciousness that they're bringing up is nothing new.
Right.
They are tapping into what I would call like the archetypal center of what democracy is. And the novel approaches from the fascists of our day are tapping into that piece of novelty for oppression, for a war machine, and things like that. And this quote will give it a little more context. Now I'm officially bringing Mann back in the room. I'm going to be sturdier about that. So, in what seems to me to be necessary is that democracy should answer this fascist strategy with a rediscovery of itself, which can give it the same charm of novelty. Yes, a much higher one than that which fascism seeks to exert. It should put aside the habit of taking itself for granted, of self-forgetfulness. It should use this wholly unexpected situation, the fact, namely, that it has again become problematical, to renew and rejuvenate itself by again becoming aware of itself. Fascism is a child of the times, a very offensive child, and draws whatever youth it possesses out of the times. But democracy is timelessly human, and timelessness always implies a certain amount of potential youthfulness, which need only be realized in thought and feeling in order to excel. And I'm going to go right into the next one. And I'm going to read the next three, and then I'll pose some more questions. I call democracy timelessly human in fascism, its opponent, which today is so triumphantly asserting itself, a transitory manifestation. In doing so, I am not forgetting that fascism also has deep and perhaps indestructible roots in human nature, for its essence is force. It is in physical and mental oppression that fascism believes. This is what it practices, loves, honors, and glorifies. Oppression is not only the ultimate goal, but the first principle of fascism. And we all know only too well that force as a principle is just as eternally human as its opposite, the idea of justice. It is the stern fact-creating principle. That's what force is. It is the stern fact-creating principle. It can accomplish everything, or practically everything. Once it has subjugated the body through fear, it can even subjugate thought. For man, in the long run, cannot live a double life. In order to live in harmony with himself, he adapts his thoughts to the manner of life that force imposes upon him. All this force can accomplish. Daily, we see justice grow pale before it and perish, because force is oppressive materialism, and in the field of experience is usually the victor, whereas justice is only an idea. But this only, bitter and pessimistic as it may sound, is nevertheless full of pride and firmest confidence. Confidence which does not arise out of puerile and artificial idealism, but is, on the contrary, based upon a greater knowledge of nature and reality of man than the only semi-intelligent belief in force. So, what I want to invite in terms of comments and ideas and questions, first of all, this force principle is a real problem for us, right? It's the creator and destroyer. How does this idea of someone not being able to live a double life in order to live in harmony with herself and adapting the thoughts of the matter of life that force imposes upon her. How does that play out in our lives right now? I'm very open to hearing some examples of that. And then also this piece where he says, he's talking about justice, and this comment about, but this only, bitter and pessimistic as it may sound, is nevertheless full of pride and firmest confidence. The idea that on one end, and he does go into Descartes a little bit before this, I basically stripped the excerpts to be really just what I would call like the reverberations and resonances, and I cut out the Schopenhauer and the others. And here he goes into this dichotomy of force and justice, these two principles. And the only comment there about how, you know, the problem is justice is only an idea, and then how he wants, you know, his American audience to be like, but wait a minute, like that's the coolest thing about justice. That only comment rings to me. So out of those different questions and ideas, I would love to hear from you about what he has to say. There. Yeah, Vim.
Is he saying that the force is both? I thought it was. I was reading more that oppression and justice was on the opposite end, and force is the continuum between.
Yeah, definitely. You're right with that. And what I mean by I did mean oppression and justice.
Okay.
But the force principle being the thing that we really screw up, and how we can't live a double life. That's like what I'm curious about, because without force, nothing gets done, right? Like we need it. Yet it's the principle that we are it's so sexy to have a forceful person tell us, like, I'm gonna, like we were already talking about this, like, I'm gonna fix this right now, right? It's like, oh yeah, like we're driven towards that. And democracy is only an idea, or justice is only an idea. And how do we navigate this?
I'm sorry, go ahead, Conrad.
No, I was going to pose the question of democracy in the sea life of the ocean. How does that work? Because I think that's what we are. I think we are fishes. And there is really the concept of democracy ruling the ocean seems very foreign to me.
What about justice? You know,
I don't think there's a lot of justice in the ocean.
so I don't think there is either. There's a balance.
I think that's really what it comes down to. And the balance can go out of whack. And it does.
You know, he does mention in this that this, and we're going into, it folds into his definition of democracy. And I'm glad you brought this up. He does mention that this idea of justice, that only the idea thing, is what makes us human. And that is problematical.
It is. It's narrow. Yeah.
How does Mann define justice?
Well, how do you think he does in these passages? Because that's pretty much how he defines it in this work.
He seems to treat it, you know, I presume he had a classical education, and Plato is reverberating in the back of his mind somewhere. And Plato's treatment of the question, what is justice? And the you know, the fact that justice is happening every day in minor and major ways, but because they're not as dramatic as the happenings of force, we might overlook them. You know, force force is dramatic, force is yang, justice is yin. And, you know, unless we're looking for it, it's not going to hit us over the head. Because, go ahead.
Well, one thing I'll say about Mann's education is he was a terrible student, and he learned through myth. And so, like, his idea of justice, aside from the one that he's offering here, which is basically, you know, looking at just a situation where there's an oppressor and that's not fair, now we need to go in and save it. Like, I don't want to make it too elementary, but his mythologies that he follows in his writing are very much mimetic of the great books of the past. You know, he's famous for rewriting Goethe's Faustus. So when you think of justice, think of Faustus. Yeah.
Well, I just something that struck me when he made that contrast between force and justice, or oppression and justice, coming out of, for me, coming out not from a classical education, but a say Germanic Protestant line. The contrast isn't justice and oppression, it was always justice and mercy. That justice was seen as somewhat oppressive, too oppressive. And that you needed to balance it with mercy. So it's like he's got it on the other end, kind of, than that strong tradition in Lutheranism.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I do think that part of his bourgeoisie, like, and that he goes into kind of how do you even have democracy without education, and we're gonna maybe touch on that tonight. He does, make no mistake, like, Mann is a man that thinks that he is smarter and more capable than most.
Stable genius.
He's a stepson of Plato.
Right, and so, like, his ideas of justice, and he does mention it in terms of old school Plato, is like, imagine like the philosopher king and how much of a mess that would be. But no, I love this. The dichotomy isn't perfect that he chooses here, but the one that he does choose is oppression and justice. And then he goes into the oppression of the Jews and the concentration camps, which, by the way, like, in 1938, it's, you know, people are still thinking, you know, what Hitler's doing over there is cool. You know, like, I forget what year he was Time Magazine's Man of the Year. It may have been 38. But, you know, he's definitely commenting on what Franco, Mussolini, and Hitler are up to, and how they need to be held accountable. And that's what justice is to him. And we'll see, he even calls for conflict, you know, to defend it.
So then, I'm sorry, go ahead. No, please.
Who wants to do it?
Sandra.
Yeah.
I constantly constantly go from the spectrum of the individual and the state, right? Or the state could be the religion.
Or the community.
Mm-hmm.
The individual or the community.
Well, yeah. I mean, I have trouble seeing.
You're stacking the decks.
I'm thinking of the state, whether it's a religious state or, I'm not thinking of a group of individuals which form community more intentionally, let's say. But so I'm not too sure in that oppression, force, justice, we go from one to the other. Also, can you use the word, I keep thinking of Steiner for some reason, and his will as opposed to force. So, and will and thought and feeling. And earlier at the beginning of your Mann reading, he was saying we need the thought and feeling, right? Which puts a whole different.
Yeah, I want to get back in, because what you're saying, he does in traditional Mann style, even though his reading or his writing is difficult for some people to, like, take in, because it's very fully ripened. Like his sentences go on forever. I love his writing. It really speaks to me. But what you're saying right now, he does comment on soon. And it'll become a little bit more clear. But I think that the point of the force piece is that he's using that as like a method. And he's talking about how the fascists use it and for oppression, and how he's going to eventually basically turn it in and say, and now democracy needs to use it to beat up fascism. And the force principle is the innate piece within us. And so he's setting it up, and he's giving people examples of the Jews being, separated from families, thrown into detention centers, things like that. Things that ring really true.
Positing the individual that needs to use the force in the face
No.
of oppression? No.
No.
But how do you go from one
to the other? I think for him,
United States and Britain.
I think for him, and by the way, he was like having dinner with FDR. Like, I think he would looked at it as, like, look at this democratic socialistic genius. Like, people need to look at him and what he's doing, and he needs to fight for Europe because Europe is falling apart. Like, basically, this whole lecture is him saying, "Yo, like, it's falling apart over there." And he's not even talking about America. He's talking about how America is.
So he's trying to get a foreign country to attack his own.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but he's trying to. You are such a trickster. He's trying to make people wake up.
Yeah.
Because he's basically like, all those dominoes fall. What do you think is going to happen here? And democracy needs rejuvenation.
And this is 38, before the war.
Yeah.
That's such a significant year. I mean, this
Yes.
is all sort of, we're looking at the birth. Yeah. And I just, it's so funny. I was just at the Nordic Museum in Seattle 2 days ago, and one of the big Nordic myths, I was a philosopher I'd never heard of, who wrote something called The Middle Way, which was a folk, political, social, and it was something that inseminated the Nordic countries. I'll say the Nordic countries, and today you see they are more democratic than most any place in the world, and it's this middle way. And FDR became an advocate of the middle way as a result of this Nordic.
Oh yeah, we're cooking up. There's some more good stuff here that fits in with this. I want to definitely I'm going to read the next 4, because this is where we finally get into James's question that he asked right away about how kind of Mann defines democracy.
And justice.
You perceive, ladies and gentlemen, that I wish to give the word democracy a very broad meaning, a much broader one than the merely political sense of this word would suggest. For I'm connecting it with the highest human attributes, with the idea and the absolute. I'm relating it to the inalienable dignity of mankind, which no force, however humiliating, can destroy. This I must do if I am to fulfill the request which has been put to me, namely, to declare my faith in the ultimate victory of democracy over the tendencies and forces which threaten it today. It is sufficient. I want to make one comment, but I don't want anyone else to make a comment. I think that actually is where Marianne Williamson is, right there, in that last piece, in terms of declaring faith in democracy. Listen to the spiritual language there. It is insufficient to define the democratic principle as the principle of majority rule and to translate democracy literally, all too literally, as government by the people, an expression of double meaning which could also signify mob rule, for that is more nearly the definition of fascism. We must reach higher. We must define democracy as that form of government and of society which is inspired above every other with the feeling and consciousness of the dignity of man. To become conscious means to acquire conscience. To become conscious means to acquire conscience, means the knowledge of what is good and what is evil. Nature that is infrahuman does not know this difference. And this is where we were talking about the oceans. Nature that is infrahuman does not know this difference. It is without guilt. In humanity, nature becomes responsible. Man is nature's fall from grace. Only it is not a fall, but just as positively an elevation as conscience is higher than innocence. This dignity, which the mysterious confers upon man, democracy recognizes and honors. Democracy's understanding and respect for this quality it calls humanity. So, what do you think of his definition
Of what?
of democracy, or his vision of democracy?
This last passage you read, Carl Jung could have written that.
Yeah. Which, by the way, it's important to note they were, contemporaries. They knew of each other. Mann was a Freud guy. He kind of went with him in the divorce. But Karl Karenyi was Mann's chief mythologist, just as Karl Karenyi was Jung's chief mythologist. And there's this wonderful book called Mythology and Humanism of the letters of Karenyi and Mann. And basically, Karenyi is feeding him Jung in a way where it's palatable for Mann, because he viewed Freud as the end-all be-all. He looked at Jung, because Mann was very conservative. He looked at Jung as like the ungrateful little brat of the psychoanalytic movement.
Yeah, just bring up the fish again.
Yeah.
I think in a sense that does speak to it. I don't know that it is anything that, it's a pretty complex thing, but that Mann reflects in 1938 and the 50s and 60s would be this sense of the goal is human progress and humanity being human, having this consciousness, having this ability to define justice, to say what's right in the world. When there's things wrong in the world, it's up to human beings to say what's right and fix it. Well, I think this century, we're getting a sense that we haven't been all that good at that. And that maybe that's not true. And so I think there's that self-uncertainty and lack of confidence right now, or the sense that our past confidence has gotten us in a lot of trouble. Yeah. And that Mann is not in a place in history that recognizes that yet. He's on the battlefield. He's like John Paul facing the communists, not caring whether or not he's discussing young schoolgirl.
Yeah. To become conscious is to acquire conscience. Right, and at that
right,
time, him saying that isn't the norm.
Well, I'm saying that is a very optimistic, human-centered, speciesist view of reality. It says, yes, we are right, and that we get this development of conscience because we're human, and that's what's those combination of things has allowed it to take over and destroy the world.
So that I'm with you, and that missing piece that he brings up is democracy. It's like that, the dignity which the mysterious confers upon us, right? Democracy recognizes and honors.
But then you look at the
other
results
forms don't. Yeah.
And say, is that?
But as we've already mentioned here tonight, like we've never really experienced a democracy entirely, right?
As close as you can get in the modern world. Maybe you could have a democracy of a small 200-person tribal band.
Yeah, how would we this room fare?
We're not exactly representative of mass.
All of these words here could be said by a fascist.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was thinking about it.
Just bottom line, so it's not your words. You can invoke all the wonderful principles you want and seduce any number of people. I would say it's your actions. And also when you put conscience is higher than innocence, which is bringing some of this in, Hillman would talk, and I think Jung would too, about our multiple selves, our multiple, so yeah, he does though, he starts to. He talks about the necessity even for personality number 1 and number 2, which was a conflict we had here looking at it at the very beginning.
Yeah. So the mention of the ocean, if I can say something, is so interesting because I could feel the silence in the room after you talked about the analogy. You know, you bring the analogy of the species and the ocean, which is sort of like a Darwinian determinism that takes all the notion of democracy away very quickly. But most importantly, it puts the entire discussion on an angle that has a different dimension, which is the one that John keeps going back to. You know, there's not a single meeting here where John doesn't say, I'm very anguished. You know, I'm very anguished. And I want to echo. Yeah, I want to echo that.
Whatever this.
I think that, I think that action, I'm going to take Sandra's word at the end of what she said. The time for words, in a way, has passed. There is a sense that we're at the end of the runway. I don't know how I got the feeling, but we're sort of at the end of the runway.
Yeah. I think part of the reason why I found such comfort in the community here on our Thursday nights is because I too feel that way. And I'm a idealistic person, and those things aren't even in conflict for me.
Well, isn't an end a beginning? So you don't learn to pain and fear more than so how much maybe we need more pain and change. The pain threshold is getting pretty high.
A lady, when I was at the coffee shop just making this, she looked over my shoulder and then said, you know, Trump is the greatest teacher that this country could ever have. And of course, I put my glasses on. I was like, all right, how is this going to go? Like, it could go a lot of different ways. But I'll say this: I've always been obsessed with politics because my internal sense of justice is strong, and I've never been more full of fear than I am now. And so, like,
That's a good.
There's a history.
Yeah, that's what I was going to get at. It's like what you said makes me feel like I'm paying attention. You know, like the people that my partner and I, we were just in Wisconsin for like 4 or 5 nights, and it scares me how like some people it doesn't like affect at all. You know, and that's what this whole tour in 1938 was. Him going around being like, you should be terrified. Like, you should be afraid of the fascism that's happening.
Yeah, but we weren't until we get attacked. Also,
I'll say this, for the
Hang
same
on,
reason.
let James finish.
You do finish? No.
just real quick, because you're young and stuff. So growing up in the 70s, we had Vietnam War, people getting massacred. It's on TV all the time. And their TV. That was fear. And then they have the corrupt Nixon shit. That was so like what you're experiencing now is another trip.
Yeah. Is it Diet Coke compared to
But no, I mean you're translating rapidly with Coke. You know, so I mean people were dying. So,
But you comment about
Democrats finally using the force that you were just talking about. Stop being whipping around. Don't, oh well, you know our ideas. No, you can't get. You got to get a baseball bat. The norms of
But your comment about, regrowth after pain reminds me of the question they asked Einstein about World War III. And he said, I don't know about World War III, but what I know is that World War IV will be fought with clubs and stones.
We're going to get back into...
there is no renewal after this destruction that is coming our way.
And Chomsky, one of my favorite thinkers, I know one of Ben's favorite thinkers, I think part of the reason why I'm so terrified is because I take so much stock in Chomsky. David, and then I want to get back to Mann.
But on this thought,
yeah.
Okay, for the same reason that Mann did his seminars and things in 1938, is exactly the same reason you're here tonight.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
What a good analogy. Perfect. Yes. Yes. You're right, David.
So channel Dr. Mann.
Yeah.
So could you elevate about 6 inches off the
proud.
He did already. Yeah.
I gotta go on to this one because I just think it's so wonderful. This is where we talk about some social norms that are needed to boost thinking and education. This is what my whole thing is. And think about how, as I read these excerpts, how we can cultivate a better thinking machine as a culture. How we can cultivate a better thinking machine. More of this, right? Like this, I know this is a little awkward and we're kind of talking over one another. That's what I want. That's what we need. How do we cultivate this and make it more normal?
Come to our conference.
Yes. All right, so democracy wishes to elevate mankind, to teach it to think, to set it free. It seeks to remove from culture the stamp of privilege and disseminate it among the people. In a word, it aims at education. Education is an optimistic and humane concept, and respect for humanity is inseparable from it. There exists a caricature of this modern anti-intellectualism, which has nothing whatsoever to do with democracy, but which lands us in the middle of the base of a demagogic world of fascism. This is the contempt of pure reason, the denial and violation of truth in favor of power and interests of the state or of the individual, the appeal to the lower instincts, the so-called feeling, the release of stupidity and evil from the discipline of reason and intelligence. In short, a barbaric mob movement beside which what we call democracy certainly stands out as aristocratic to the highest degree. In a democracy which does not respect the intellectual life and is not guided by it, demagogy has free play, and the level of national life is depressed to that of the ignorant and of the uncultivated. Kakistocracy.
Okay.
I'm gonna switch to the next page, and I'm gonna start. I'm not gonna read the top excerpt. The next 3 are what I'm gonna read, and then I'm gonna open it up to more discussion. And the ones I'm skipping are more about that. Well, he calls it like the hurrah feeling, the sensation that we get from that feeling function when we get in line and do Sig Heil. Like he's kind of explaining what that feeling does. So democracy's danger is the humane illusion, the virtuous belief, and this is why I skipped to this, the virtuous belief that compromise with this new creature is possible, so that it can be won over to an idea of peace and collective reconstruction by forbearance, friendliness, or amicable concessions. That is a dangerous mistake which is founded on the wholly different thought process of the democratic and of the fascist mentality. The fascist interpretation of the world and of history is one of absolute force, wholly free of morality and reason and having no relation to them. Its demands cannot be satisfied and quieted with concessions, but are thoroughly vague, indefinable, and boundless. In every friendly gesture, in every concession to its demands, it will always see only a sign of weakness, of resignation, and of timely abdication. As for Germany, it is both too soon and too late for a sympathetic recognition of its demands. Perhaps us as well. It is necessary that democracy should understand this. It must also understand the advantages which fascism derives from a world situation in which the distinction between war and peace is wiped out, and neither the one nor the other distinctly prevails. It is probable that fascism will continue to prefer this kind of war to actual warfare as long as possible, for a real war would reveal the important role which lies and deception play in a totalitarian state. So, I want you to think of the compromises that have already occurred, the compromises that maybe are even happening today in Washington. In Mann's time as well, the concessions, Hitler, the Mussolini,
Peace in wartime.
right? Where is the line? Because fascists, as he would say, the line is always moving. Every single day, it's a little bit further and further and further until it's met with force, because its only language is force, right? So where is our line in terms of our democracy? And like he said, for Germany, it's too soon and too late. And man, how right was he? So think about that, and then also, how is it that we, on an individual level, think about these same drives in your relationships? How is it that we allow for those lines to be so blurred? Yeah.
Okay, I'm going back to some of the first text you read about education.
Cool.
Because I have to call out Mann on a certain level of, I can't think of the right word. Anyhow, my education in Germany, which our educational system is adapted from, was oriented to creating obedient, good workers.
The Prussian model.
It
That's
was in service of the industrial machine. It was not in service of creating good thinkers. It was not in service of questioning authority.
Mann didn't even believe in the education. He's a doctor because of the University of Bonn gave him a doctorate for his. He actually hated. He didn't do well in gymnasium. He didn't. The whole system. I even remember giving John a book about. Called School for Barbarians. So like when he means education, he's not talking about that model. He's talking about true, in its true form. And he does go into aristocracy, and he used that word, and then he defined it because he was nervous that Americans would immediately equate that with power and privilege up here. But what he means by education is almost entirely the arts. Is reading, is thinking, is writing, opera, things like that. And he was very highfalutin when it came to that. So I think you're right in terms of the model. I mean,
yeah, he's thinking that, but it doesn't exist there or here. Except in maybe, like elite little communities like St. John's College or something like that.
So I don't know. I would say, like, I don't want to belabor this, but it does exist because that's what I do. That's my life's work. And even though I'm not in a position that I want to be in, and maybe the reason why I'm not is because I do it this way. But there are a lot of people out there.
I think Lisa is talking about at the middle school level, public schools in America. I'm gonna, borrow your thoughts, but.
Well, and what he's getting into here is we need to reform the education system. And we need, and that it's too late and it's too soon.
It's the last bastion of capitalism. Middle school, sixth grade.
I take your point because, like, it triggers me to think about, years ago, focusing on this stuff and not having a place to talk about it. How many, we're weirdos, right? And there are a lot of other weirdos out there.
Totally.
And find them. And because the system doesn't want this, right? That's, I take your point with that. But back to this idea of where the line is, I wanna talk a little more about that because personally speaking, my partner and I, when Trump won the election, we were horrified, and we started talking about our line right off the bat. Like, when this happens, we're out. And that line hasn't been crossed yet. I'll share that. But a lot of other really uncomfortable things moving towards that line have. And I just, like, as a culture, growing up, you know, the kids dying in captivity, I think that that would have been a pretty clear line. At least now I think that, right? And now, like, where are we? Like, we all are on our little robots and we think we know what the line is, right? And that cinemastatic environment that John points us to is really dangerous because we don't have conversations like this with one another. Maybe we do with loved ones, a few people at a time, but in a room, we don't talk about what the line is. You know, so I'm curious, like, where do you think it is?
Why do you say there has to be a line?
Well, she has something to say about that. I don't want to talk about my own stuff the whole time.
Yeah, that would. So your question was, referring to you and your partner, if it reaches this point, we're out.
Yeah.
So I don't know what "we're out" means, because I feel like my line has been crossed 1,000 times, 100,000 times. For thousands of years, my line has been crossed.
Yes.
Tens of thousands of years.
I guess what I mean by that is more in the Mannian sense, like how he bolted Germany to Switzerland, to the United States. And then when the United States, even though, you know, he had dinner with FDR for years, labeled him a communist, and then he jumped off the United States because it wasn't safe for him here anymore. You know, like he hopped around.
Yeah, so that means you leave the country.
Yes.
You become an exile, an expat.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so that's a very...
So in Mann's language, it's when I can't breathe anymore.
You have to find someplace that has more oxygen.
Yes. Yeah. And then, you know, I'm really excited for the Jung Gebser conference because I think part of the unconscious emergency is that that hop is not as simple anymore.
It may not be geographical either.
And the problems that face us are beyond fascism, which, yeah, again, scares the shit out of me. But yes.
The more I read him, I see him more of a writer than a visionary in this sense. His writings are more poetic than operational, in the sense that, like, when I was reading exactly like the thing that you were saying, where I was imagining like Hitler saying all these words, and it totally made sense. I mean, like, made sense coming out of his mouth. Because there are great gray areas in here, which evil can lurk. And I think the biggest evil that could come out of this kind of narrative is believing in a good and an evil. I think that is the greatest threat to any democratic system. Believing that there is a right way of doing things, there is a line, a Rubicon. This kind of thinking, I think, is the breeding ground for any sort of tyrannical or fascistic, way of thinking. That is why I believe that a true democracy is going to look very docile and sitting back and acting as a judge, more as a trainer and a coach in comparison. As soon as people start acting, or systems start acting as a leader and a coach and a force for good, we've ventured into dangerous territories, in the sense that I am gonna, as the person who has the reins of power at hand, I am gonna trample on rights of some people, of some people. I am gonna ignore the worldviews of some people based upon what I believe in, and so on and so forth. Education, he talks about education, for example. Again, he believes in the type of education that he believes in is good for humanity and good for democracy. Human beings have been putting their kids and themselves through education since the beginning of time. if we don't see them as good, as some of them as good, is because we don't agree with them. They didn't believe that that's not the right of education. The type of education that the Taliban is putting their kids through is education, but it's that type of education that I might not necessarily believe in. So just talking about education.
I have to say, like, he is pointing out that the dichotomy is that's what fascism breeds on. And the good education, and he talks about there is a very good and evil, and I'm very different in the way that you think. I would say there is very clearly a good way of education, and that is honoring and dignifying human life.
Exactly.
And that's what he's pointing to.
That's another minefield. Dignity.
Yeah.
I mean, like that again, Hitler talked about dignity of German people. Ayatollahs in Iran are talking about the dignity of Iranian people. We in America talk about the dignity. The white slave owners in the South talked about the dignity of and purity of like the educated and intelligent men. That's a very, very dangerous area to venture in.
And
what's the alternative?
The alternative is, I think, to be honest with you, the short answer is I don't know. But the kind of a medium-long answer would be, I think in the best situation that we can arrive at is, again, in a situation that every person has a voice which is weighed exactly equal to everybody else, every other person in the society. And the role of the government is, the democratic government, is to create the environment and set up the environment in a way that one person, one voice can be enacted and can be implemented. That's it.
So all voices are equal.
All voices are equal. I mean, like
Do you really believe all voices are equal?
I don't want to believe in that, but I have no other choice but that.
I wanna bring it back here, because I think that what you're saying.
No, but theoretically, the question is,
Hold on, I want to bring it
theoretically?
back to Mann really quick, because I think what you're saying is actually what he's pointing to.
Okay.
And you know, the next two passages I'm going to read might clear it up a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to read the bottom passage on this page where it starts with "It is not," and this is about the reforms that we need. It is not the sort of humanity which is weak and patient to the point of self-doubt that freedom needs today. Such an attitude makes freedom look pathetic and contemptible in the face of a power concept. What is needed is a humanity strong in will and firm in determination to preserve itself. Freedom must discover its virility, which I really have problems with that, but it must learn to walk in armor and to defend itself against deadly enemies. And after the most bitter experiences, it must finally understand that pacifism, which admits it will not wage war under any circumstance, will surely bring about war instead of banishing it. If democracy wishes to make its undoubted moral superiority over fascism effective and challenge its pseudo-socialism, it must adopt in the economic as well as the spiritual domain as much of socialistic morality as the times make imperative and indispensable. And so that means that, and this is radical for Mann because he really is a rich kid. He is a guy who, bathed in privilege every single day of his life. And he's basically saying, in order for democracy to work, there needs to be a socialistic morality, and as much as the time permits and can afford. And that is economic, that is spiritual, that is educational, that is all of it, right? And his socialism is obviously, and he goes into what it is compared to, this brand of socialism that the fascists use. But what you were just speaking of in terms of, what is good and what is evil in a society, what he means in terms of what is good is definitely a collective thing that is much more difficult to narrow down. But what he's pointing to is that these reforms must happen in order to even begin to understand what is evil and to know what you need to fight against, right? And so that last, about the moral superiority over fascism and the socialistic need. And obviously he's FDR right there, right? He's talking about that. The question I want to pose really briefly before I end with his last two paragraphs of the speech that he gave out is, what socialistic morality is imperative and dispensable today? We are tugging all over the place, and there's a really healthy conversation, or maybe it's not healthy, I don't know, but there's a conversation happening today about that. And I'm curious where the line, again, to use that term, like what can we do? What reforms can we make economically or spiritually or educationally right now? Or can we?
So we get stuck thinking in polarities as if one pole is good and the other pole is bad, and we flip back between them, over time, and somehow we have to learn to balance the upsides and the downsides of the poles. That there is, depending, it's like the heart. The heart gets the parasympathetic nerves saying, speed up, and the sympathetic nerves saying, slow down. Okay, and that's dependent on all the input that's coming in from, how fast you're walking or running, what your emotional state is, how fast you're breathing, what you're thinking, and all of that stuff goes into the heart rate. So when we get stuck in let's just go faster and faster and faster, we end up with heart attacks. If we go slower and slower and slower, we end up in death. We end up in death either way. What I'm trying to say is that we need to get out of thinking in terms of fascism and socialism, in terms of democracy and monarchy, and understand that these polarities are intrinsic to our being, and that there are positive aspects of them and negative aspects.
Definitely. So what Mann is asserting here is that if we are going to claim moral superiority over fascism in a democratic state, the only way that works is through social reforms, right? So I'm not trying to set up a polarity here. It's if we want to kill budding fascism around the world, right? I think maybe there is a fascist in here, but I doubt it. Like,
does he say that in that book? I'm sorry. Social reforms. Does he say that?
He does.
Really?
Social, spiritual, economic reform is needed. And so if we want to, if maybe not kill fascism because we can't, because it's within us, right? If we want to quell it, calm it down, what social reforms are we ready for, and which ones can we afford? Because that is what he claims will mellow out fascism.
I'm sorry, but I think this is 1938, and it's no longer a relevant question because we had, he did not see World War II. He did see, I assume,
he lived all the way through it, yeah.
He lived all the way through it.
He saw all the way.
So would he write the same thing? I mean, we have, in order to defeat fascism, we had an alliance of military powers. We had two military powers.
We're not talking about war. We're talking about the idea of a totalitarian state coming in, feeding and preying on.
But we're talking
on-
about force, and right now we have force being expressed not as a tool of enlightenment, but a tool of dominant military powers, multiple powers. It's not just the US anymore. We could call all of the powers fascist: Russia, China,
Yeah.
the US, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
That's it. Yeah.
So I don't see how, and all are combined in a war to annihilate life on the planet, period. We're already well underway in that task. So all these questions seem somehow, I'm being terribly pessimistic
Yeah.
and cynical.
No, that's
but
okay.
they
So
seem
why
irrelevant.
I think it's entirely irrelevant
Mhm.
is because if we don't want this wave to completely annihilate the planet, people need to be a part of the conversation. People need to be empowered. People need to be educated. People need food. People need shelter. Like the basic stuff I'm talking about here. And if people don't get that, and what I've seen in my lifetime are communities fold, right? And then anger emerge, a vacuum emerge, fascist comes in, boom, right? Like that's the scenario that I'm seeing. And so socialistic reforms, be they economical, educational, spiritual, I think that they're entirely relevant to our time. And I think that
How do you distinguish that from Stalin? I mean,
So this-
Thomas Mann's socialism ended up being just as aggressive as
So
Nazi.
this goes back to what Lisa was saying, and sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, about assertiveness. I mean, the question that I have, Lisa, is assertiveness that you were talking about in this day and age. Is it individual? Is it the kind of assertiveness that we can create out of this group and we decide to pick it, in front of the State House? I'm curious. Assertiveness, how do you see it happening? How is the social movement of assertiveness going to happen for us to turn around the tide of ecological disaster, which is our main fascist fear this day and age? Capitalism doesn't give a shit about plants, about trees, about the ocean, about the coral reef. That's the main fascist force in the face of humanity today. And we need to somehow fight it. We got to turn it around, or we're not going to be around for too much longer. I know it sounds like a broken record. I'm going back to John Dodson. It's like, I'm really concerned. I'm really
so,
concerned.
two quick comments, and I'm gonna finish off because I love finishing right on time. I promise. Is he does go into Stalin
It's so fascist.
in it as well. But thanks. The train. Oh man, you're awful. So what I was alluding to there, and what I was curious to learn about, and maybe we'll have private conversations later, are I'm really concerned about the upcoming election in terms of what I've heard in terms of democratic socialist ideas that I am like right in line step with. I've heard other people, very adamantly opposed to it. And that conversation, I think we should have as a group sometime, because I'm curious. I want to know more about what you all think about that. That's the reality, because I think that we do have differing opinions on certain points. So I want to end, and so the one thing I want to mention about this is that he does go more in depth and uses real examples from his time, and I tried my best to kind of cut and paste so that the 1938 world didn't seem so distant, and that's why he names names. In today's world, we call it, he gives receipts, right? Like he points out in 1938, Mussolini's blemishes as well as Stalin's and so on and so forth. The only person that he doesn't call out is FDR, because he loves FDR at this time. But so these are the last two paragraphs. And again, think about, now I'm inviting you to 1938. And this is him trying to, make a living in the United States. And this is, he got a great cushy job at Princeton from this lecture tour. But I also think a lot of this whole thing rings true today. We were all of us inclined to view political and social matters as non-essentials that might as well be entrusted to politicians. And we were foolish enough to rely on the ability of these specialists to protect our highest interests. Not long after the war, and he's talking about World War I, however, I recognized that the threat to liberty, which was beginning to take form in Germany, and almost alone among writers, I warned the public to the best of my powers. And then the last bit, and he really did stand up against Nazism, more than most. Here it will be possible, here it must be possible, to carry out those reforms of which I've spoken, to carry them out by peaceful labor without crime and bloodshed. I believe, in fact, that for the duration of the present European Dark Age, the center of Western culture will shift to America. America has received much from Europe, and that debt will be amply repaid if, by saving our traditional values from the present gloom, she can preserve them for a brighter future that will once again find Europe and America united in the great tasks of humanity. So I leave you with one last question right on time. Where do we look as Americans in today's, which I would consider a very dark age? Where do we look? And Greta's a good start, right?
She's fabulous.
All right. Thank you all for participating. It really means a lot to me. Thank you.
If you would like a complete weekend of this, we'll be at a sign. And why Dan is not presenting, I don't know, because I know I suggested that you're going to be there.
I will be there.
That's what matters. I do recommend this book, School for Barbarians, which is by Thomas Mann's daughter, which you recommended to me. I read the cover and cover and sent to my son, who is a middle school teacher in Seattle. So that's it. Yeah.
What's your book about? School for Barbarians?
School for Barbarians.
What is it about?
How to
It's about the